Xerion trade nexus had been designed by committee, which explained why it looked like a crystal cathedral had mated with a shopping mall and produced something that offended every aesthetic sensibility known to carbon-based life. Floating in the contested zone between three stellar territories, it served as neutral ground where civilized species could conduct their affairs without the messy inconvenience of actually trusting each other. Dr. Kira Voss adjusted her position in the deliberately uncomfortable chair. Another committee decision, no doubt, and watched 6 different species pretend they weren't sizing each other up for weaknesses. The morning's agenda concerned mining rights to the Kepler Tertiary System, a collection of mineral-rich rocks that nobody particularly wanted until they realized somebody else might get them first. The preliminary surveys indicate substantial rare earth deposits, announced Delegate Prime Thex Guy, his towering frame casting shadows across the holographic displays. The Velkari possessed an annoying habit of making everything sound like a royal proclamation, probably because their homeworld's gravity had stretched them into 8-foot-tall paragons of presumed superiority. Our geological assessment teams have conducted thorough analysis. Fascinating, Voss interjected, not bothering to hide her amusement. Your geological teams, the same ones who missed the subsurface instabilities on Rigel 7. The chamber's atmospheric recyclers hummed louder, as if the station itself was uncomfortable with the sudden tension. Around the curved table, representatives from the hegemony's member species exchanged glances that would have been meaningful if Voss had cared enough to decode them. Councillor Zeftar, whose species the Keth had evolved in high-pressure environments and consequently spoke as if every word cost them oxygen, leaned forward. The human delegate questions our competence? Not at all, Voss replied cheerfully. I'm questioning your methodology. There's a difference, though I understand the distinction might be subtle. Thexai's golden eyes narrowed to slits. The Velkari had expressive faces when they wanted to, and right now he wanted everyone to know exactly how little patience he had for upstart species who had barely crawled out of their gravity wells. Perhaps Dr. Voss would enlighten us with her superior human wisdom. The phrase dripped with enough condescension to drown a small planet. Voss had heard variations of it at every diplomatic function for the past 3 years, ever since humanity had achieved interstellar travel and promptly discovered they were the galactic equivalent of the new kid at school, the weird one who ate lunch alone and probably had cooties. Well, she said, pulling up her own holographic display, your surveys focused exclusively on surface mineral concentrations and primary geological formations. Standard procedure, very thorough, very traditional. And the question came from negotiator Velthara, a Zanari whose pale blue skin had taken on a distinctly frosty hue. Her species communicated emotional states through pigmentation changes, which made poker games with them tragically one-sided. And you completely ignored the microbiological indicators? Voss's fingers danced across her control interface, overlaying new data onto the existing survey maps. These formations show clear signs of chemosynthetic bacterial activity. The mineral deposits aren't just sitting there. They're actively being processed by local microorganisms. The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind that pressed down on conversations and left them gasping for air. Around the table, 6 different species suddenly found their data pads fascinating. Microorganisms, Thexai repeated, his voice carrying the same tone most people reserved for discussing parasitic infections. You wish us to base our extraction strategies on bacteria. I want you to base your strategies on reality, Voss shot back. These microorganisms are breaking down the mineral matrices at a rate that makes your extraction timeline completely meaningless. By the time your equipment arrives, half the accessible deposits will have been converted to unusable compounds. This is preposterous, snarled Commander Rixan, the Dracori military observer whose scales shifted from deep blue to angry red. We have conducted mining operations across 17 systems using proven methodologies and lost 12% efficiency to biological interference, Voss finished. I've reviewed your public excavation reports. Very educational reading, by the way, particularly the part where you blamed unforeseen complications for cost overruns that were entirely foreseen if you'd bothered to analyze the local ecosystem. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees, though that might have been Velthara's emotional state affecting the environmental controls. The Zenari's skin had gone from frosty blue to what could charitably be called Arctic white. Human arrogance, Thexhai said slowly, each word carefully articulated, appears to be a universal constant. He rose from his chair with the fluid grace of someone who had spent centuries perfecting the art of looking down on others. At his full height, he towered over the seated human by nearly 3 feet, his golden robes catching the chamber's crystalline lighting in ways that suggested either divine approval or expensive tailoring. Your species has been part of the galactic community for less than a decade, he continued, his voice carrying across the chamber like a judge pronouncing sentence. We have maintained peaceful cooperation for millennia. Perhaps it is time you learned proper respect for your betters. The slap, when it came, echoed through the chamber with the sharp clarity of breaking crystal. Thexgai's massive hand connected with Voss's cheek with enough force to snap her head sideways and leave a ringing silence in its wake. Around the table, 5 other species watched with the detached interest of spectators at a sporting event, not horrified, curious, waiting to see how the primitive human would respond to correction. Voss sat perfectly still for a moment, her hand rising slowly to touch the reddening mark on her face. When she looked up, her expression held the same polite interest she might show to a particularly fascinating specimen under a microscope. Interesting, she said quietly. She gathered her data pads with the methodical precision of someone performing a well-rehearsed ritual. Each device disappeared into her briefcase with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the resumed silence. When everything was properly stowed, she stood and smoothed down her jacket with the kind of attention to detail that suggested either extreme professionalism or barely contained homicidal rage. I believe this concludes today's session, she announced to the chamber. Thank you all for such an educational experience. She walked to the chamber's exit with measured steps, her heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that somehow managed to sound like a countdown timer. At the threshold, she paused and turned back to address the assembly. Oh, and Delegate Prime Thexgai? Her voice carried the same pleasant tone she'd used throughout the meeting. I do hope you've been keeping up with your calcium supplements. The door sealed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving 6 different species to contemplate the sudden realization that they might have made what humans would call a tactical error. The thing about humans, which the galaxy's more civilized species consistently failed to grasp, was that they had spent several millennia perfecting the art of creative revenge. They'd had plenty of practice, having spent most of their recorded history finding innovative ways to make each other miserable over resources, ideology, and the occasional religious disagreement about proper hat-wearing etiquette. What the hegemony had just witnessed wasn't submission. It was reconnaissance. And Dr. Kira Voss had just gathered enough data to write a very interesting report. 3 days passed with the kind of deceptive calm that preceded natural disasters and hostile takeovers. The Zerion trade nexus continued its stately rotation through contested space, blissfully unaware that its carefully maintained neutrality was about to become a historical footnote. In the hegemony's private conference suite, Delegate Prime Thex Guy lounged in his custom-fitted chair like a satisfied predator. The chamber's environmental controls had been adjusted to Velkari preferences, which meant everything was slightly too warm and carried the faint scent of whatever passed for flowers on their homeworld. Still no response from the human delegation, reported Councillor Zeptar, his compressed speech making each word sound like a pneumatic release. Their embassy remains sealed. No communications, no requests for audience. Naturally, Thex High purred, his golden eyes reflecting the chamber's ambient lighting. What did you expect? Righteous indignation? Demands for apology? Humans lack the cultural sophistication for proper diplomatic retaliation. Commander Rixan's scales shifted to a pleased orange gold, the Dracori equivalent of a smug grin. Perhaps they're drafting a strongly worded letter to their Earth Council. How terrifying. The assembled delegates shared what passed for laughter among their respective species, a collection of clicking, whistling, and harmonic vibrations that would have sounded like a broken orchestra warming up to human ears. The mining contract proceeds as scheduled, announced Negotia Velthara, her skin maintaining a steady blue-green that indicated professional satisfaction. Earth's representatives have 47 hours to accept the revised terms or forfeit their participation entirely. What none of them bothered to ask, because centuries of assumed superiority had atrophied their curiosity, was what Dr. Kira Voss had been doing during those 3 days of ominous silence. The answer would have disturbed their sleep cycles considerably. 2 levels below the main diplomatic quarters, in a section of the station normally reserved for maintenance crews and automated systems, Voss sat surrounded by enough holographic displays to outfit a small starship's command center. Her assistant, a compact woman named Chen, who possessed the disconcerting ability to make advanced xenobiology sound like recipe instructions, materialized through the secured entrance, carrying another pot of coffee. The atmospheric analysis from the Keth homeworld just came through, Chen announced, settling into her chair with practiced efficiency. Turns out their literature was being modest about the pressure requirements. They need a minimum of 2.3 standard atmospheres to maintain cognitive function. How charmingly vulnerable, Voss murmured, not looking up from her current display. Streams of genetic data cascaded across the projection, detailing the reproductive cycles of 7 different species with the clinical precision of a medical textbook. What about the Zanari temperature sensitivity? Even better than we thought. Their comfort zone spans exactly 4 degrees Celsius. Outside that range, their nervous systems start shutting down non-essential functions, including, apparently, logical reasoning. Voss finally raised her head, and the smile that played across her lips would have made sharks request transfer to safer waters. Fascinating how evolution shapes psychology, isn't it? Species that develop in narrow environmental parameters tend to develop correspondingly narrow intellectual flexibility. The holographic displays around them painted a picture that would have sent the hegemony's military advisors into collective apoplexy. Decades of accumulated research spread across multiple screens. Dietary requirements, atmospheric preferences, gravitational tolerances, biochemical vulnerabilities, and psychological profiles that read like instruction manuals for species-specific manipulation. The Earth Council wants a status report, Chen mentioned casually, as if she weren't discussing humanity's most classified intelligence operation. Admiral Harrison is getting nervous about the timeline. Harrison's always nervous. It's what makes him useful. Voss pulled up a new display, showing the Zerion station's environmental control schematics. Tell him the demonstration will proceed as scheduled. The hegemony has been gracious enough to provide us with a perfect laboratory setting. About that, Chen said, her tone shifting to something that might charitably be called concern. Are you absolutely certain about the bioweapon classification? Because, technically, We're not deploying bioweapons, Voss interrupted. We're conducting an educational seminar on human scientific methodology. The fact that our teaching aids happen to exploit critical vulnerabilities in alien physiology is purely coincidental. Chen's expression suggested she found this distinction about as convincing as a Valkyrie's claim to humility, but she didn't argue. Working with Voss for 3 years had taught her that the woman's moral flexibility was matched only by her intellectual precision. The synthetic pheromones are ready, she reported instead, calibrated for each species' olfactory receptors. The Valkyrie batch is particularly nasty. Induces rapid calcium depletion that should manifest as muscular weakness and bone fragility within minutes of exposure. How poetic. And the others? Get respiratory distress that mimics altitude sickness. Zanari experience temperature regulation failure. Their skin will cycle through every emotional state in their spectrum. The Dracori compounds trigger molting anxiety, which apparently feels like having your skeleton try to crawl out through your scales. Voss leaned back in her chair, surveying the displays with the satisfaction of an artist reviewing a masterpiece. Years of patient intelligence gathering, disguised as cultural exchange programs and scientific collaboration, had yielded a comprehensive guide to galactic vulnerabilities that would have impressed Sun Tzu. "You know what the beautiful irony is?" she asked, not expecting an answer. "They handed us everything we needed. Every diplomatic function, every trade negotiation, every cultural exchange. They treated us like entertaining primitives and never noticed we were taking notes." The calcium deficiency data came from their own medical journals, Chen agreed. Published openly because they never imagined a lesser species would understand the implications. The atmospheric pressure requirements were in their safety protocols for space construction. The temperature sensitivities were in their environmental comfort guidelines. The psychological profiles came from their own anthropological studies. Voss's fingers drummed against her chair's armrest with metronomic precision. They documented their own weaknesses and handed us the documentation because they couldn't conceive of us as a threat. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication from Earth. Voss accepted the transmission, and Admiral Harrison's weathered face materialized above her desk with the crackling clarity of quantum entanglement communication. "Doctor," he said without preamble, because military efficiency left little room for social pleasantries, "the Joint Chiefs are asking pointed questions about your methods. They're concerned about the diplomatic ramifications of what you're planning. Tell the Joint Chiefs that diplomacy failed the moment Thexai decided human faces made acceptable percussion instruments," Voss replied. "Now, we're conducting an object lesson in why evolution favors adaptability over arrogance. And if the hegemony retaliates?" Voss's smile could have powered a small city with its wattage. "With what? Their superior technology? Their advanced weaponry? Their strategic brilliance?" She gestured to the displays surrounding her. "Admiral, in the past 72 hours, I've identified 17 different ways to neutralize their entire delegation using nothing more sophisticated than atmospheric adjustments and dietary supplements. They're not retaliating because they don't understand what they're retaliating against." Harrison's expression suggested he was beginning to grasp the full scope of what his former bioweapons specialist had engineered. "Jesus, Kira, you're not just evening the score, you're rewriting the rulebook." "I'm teaching them a lesson they should have learned in primary school," she corrected. "Never assume the quiet kid in the corner isn't paying attention." The transmission ended, leaving Voss and Chen alone with their conspiracy of accumulated knowledge. Around them, the holographic displays continued their silent testimony to human patience and alien overconfidence. Tomorrow, the hegemony would discover what happened when a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of war decided to apply those lessons to the supposedly civilized realm of diplomacy. The galaxy's superior civilizations were about to receive a comprehensive education in human creativity. Whether they survived the curriculum remained to be seen. The negotiation chamber had been reconfigured for what the hegemony assumed would be humanity's formal surrender. Additional seating had been arranged to accommodate junior delegates who wanted front-row seats for the entertainment, and someone had thoughtfully adjusted the lighting to cast more dramatic shadows. Nothing said diplomatic triumph, quite like proper theatrical staging. Dr. Kira Voss entered carrying a single data pad and what appeared to be a standard medical diagnostic kit. Her appearance drew the kind of attention usually reserved for exotic zoo specimens. Curious, slightly condescending, and entirely confident in the observer's safety. "Gentlemen, ladies, and esteemed entities," she began, her voice carrying the cheerful professionalism of a university lecturer addressing first-year students. "I promised you an educational presentation on human scientific methodology. I trust you'll find it illuminating." Thextai settled deeper into his chair with the languid satisfaction of a predator watching prey walk into a trap. "By all means, Dr. Voss, please enlighten us with your primitive insights." "Primitive? Yes. Let's discuss that concept." Voss activated her datapad, and the chamber's holographic systems came alive with what looked like standard biochemical charts. "Your species classifies humans as primitive because we lack your advanced technology, your sophisticated culture, your presumed intellectual superiority. But you've made a fundamental error in your assessment." The displays shifted, showing comparative genetic analyses that made several delegates lean forward with unwilling interest. "You've confused technological advancement with evolutionary fitness," she continued. "A common mistake among species that achieve spaceflight before achieving wisdom." "Wisdom?" Commander Rigzan's scales rippled with amused bronze. "From a species that nearly destroyed itself with atomic weapons?" "Exactly." Voss's smile could have cut glass. "We nearly destroyed ourselves, Commander." "Nearly. Do you know what that means? It means we learned to survive our own stupidity. Can you say the same?" She manipulated the holographic interface, and the displays exploded into a constellation of interconnected data streams that painted a picture no one in the chamber was prepared to see. "Let's begin with basic physiology, shall we? Delegate Prime Thexgai. Your species evolved under high gravity, which gave you impressive stature and bone density. Magnificent evolutionary adaptation. Unfortunately, it also made you entirely dependent on consistent calcium absorption rates that exceed baseline requirements by 43%. Thexai's golden eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Around the table, other delegates began to shift uncomfortably as they recognized the implications of what they were witnessing. "Counselor Zeftar, the Keth respiratory system is a marvel of engineering, perfectly adapted to your homeworld's atmospheric pressure, so perfectly adapted, in fact, that deviation of more than 15% from optimal conditions triggers cascade failure of your cognitive processing centers." The Keth delegate's compressed speech became even more labored, each word emerging like air from a punctured pressure suit. "Negotiator Velthara, Zanari thermoregulation, represents evolutionary specialization taken to its logical extreme. Your species maintains perfect environmental harmony within your comfort zone. Outside that zone, your nervous system prioritizes survival over higher brain functions. Fascinating adaptation, utterly crippling vulnerability." Veltara's skin had begun cycling through colors with increasing rapidity, displaying an emotional spectrum that ranged from confusion to outright panic. "Commander Rigzan, Dracori regenerative capabilities are legendary. Your species can regrow limbs, organs, even partial brain tissue. Remarkable. What your medical literature fails to mention is that this regenerative process is triggered by specific hormonal cascades that can be artificially induced. Imagine molting every day for the rest of your life. The Dracori commander's scales had shifted to a sickly yellow-green that indicated species-wide alarm response. "Should I continue?" Voss asked pleasantly, "because I have similar assessments for each species represented here. Complete biochemical profiles, genetic vulnerabilities, psychological pressure points, and detailed instructions for exploiting every single weakness your evolution has gifted you." The chamber had fallen silent, except for the increasingly labored breathing of 6 different species as they began to comprehend the scope of what they were hearing. "This is impossible," Thexai managed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You cannot have acquired this level of detailed biological intelligence without our knowledge. Can't we?" Voss opened her medical kit with theatrical precision. "Tell me, Delegate Prime, what did you eat for breakfast this morning?" "I fail to see." "A hegemony hospitality protocol requires that visiting delegations be provided with species-appropriate cuisine, standard diplomatic courtesy. We've been analyzing every meal served in this facility for the past 3 years. Did you know that Velkari breakfast porridge contains trace minerals that, when combined with specific atmospheric additives, create a rapid absorption pathway for calcium-depleting compounds?" Thexai's face drained of color, which for a Velkari meant shifting from golden bronze to something resembling old parchment. "You're bluffing," Councillor Zeftar wheezed, though the effort of speaking was clearly becoming more difficult. Am I?" Voss retrieved a small aerosol device from her kit. "Councillor, you've been breathing recirculated atmosphere for the past 15 minutes. Atmospheric recycling systems are remarkably easy to modify if you understand the engineering specifications. Which we do, because your own safety protocols provided the blueprints." She triggered the device, and a fine mist dispersed through the chamber's ventilation system. The effect was immediate and comprehensive. Thexai doubled over as his enhanced bone structure suddenly became a liability, calcium depletion making his impressive frame feel like it was collapsing from within. Zeftar's breathing became rapid and shallow, his homeworld-adapted lungs struggling with the altered atmospheric composition. Thalthara's skin strode through every color in her species' emotional spectrum as her thermoregulation systems went haywire. Commander Rixan scratched at his scales frantically as artificial molting hormones convinced his body that shedding time had arrived ahead of schedule. Seconds soon, Dinah Welters opened their bowl open. "The beautiful irony," Voss continued conversationally, watching the hegemony delegation writhe in various states of biological distress, "is that you provided us with everything we needed to accomplish this. Your medical journals, your safety protocols, your cultural exchange programs, your dietary requirements. You documented your own weaknesses and handed us the documentation." "Stop this," Thexai gasped, his towering frame now hunched and trembling. "You're committing an act of war." "War?" Voss laughed, and the sound held no warmth whatsoever. "This isn't war, Delegate Prime. This is a science lesson. I'm teaching you about human methodology. We don't conquer through superior technology or overwhelming force. We win by paying attention." She walked slowly around the table, observing each delegate's distress with clinical interest. "While you were dismissing us as primitive upstarts, we were cataloging every biological system, every cultural weakness, every psychological pressure point that makes your species tick. You treated us like amusing pets, never imagining we might bite. The effects are temporary," she added almost as an afterthought. "Mostly." The hormonal cascade should stabilize within a few hours, assuming you receive appropriate medical attention. The calcium depletion will require dietary supplements for approximately 6 months. The psychological impact, however, may prove more persistent. She returned to her position at the head of the table, surveying the collection of supposedly superior beings who were currently learning what it felt like to have their own biology turned against them. "Now then," she said brightly, "shall we discuss those mining rights? I believe Earth's position in these negotiations has significantly improved." The silence that followed was broken only by the various sounds of 6 different species discovering that evolution was a double-edged sword, and humans had been studying both edges for quite some time. What the galaxy's civilized species had just learned was that there were fates considerably worse than death, and most of them involved having a xenobiologist with a grudge and a comprehensive understanding of your species' weak points. The medical teams arrived with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd been waiting nearby, which of course they had. Dr. Voss watched with professional interest as 6 different species received emergency treatment for what the station's records would list as a sudden onset allergic reactions to environmental contaminants. Truth was such a flexible concept in diplomatic circles. "The antidotes are quite effective," she remarked to the lead medic, a pragmatic Xerian whose own species had learned the value of neutrality through several unfortunate encounters with territorial disputes. "Full recovery expected within the time frame I mentioned. No permanent damage, assuming proper follow-up care." Texii, now propped upright by a mobility assistance frame that made his former imposing stature look like a cruel joke, managed to speak through gritted teeth. "What do you want?" "Want?" Voss appeared genuinely puzzled by the question. "I want exactly what I've always wanted. Delegate Prime. Fair and equitable treatment, in accordance with established galactic protocols. Though I admit my definition of fair has evolved somewhat over the past few days." She activated a new series of holographic displays that made the previous revelations look like amateur sketches. What materialized around the chamber was nothing less than a comprehensive intelligence assessment of every major power in the known galaxy. Technological capabilities, resource distributions, military assets, and detailed vulnerability profiles for dozens of species. "Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed entities," she announced, "allow me to present the final component of today's educational program. This is what human scientific methodology looks like when applied to strategic planning." The displays showed Earth's settlements scattered across 17 different systems, each one carefully positioned and specifically engineered. What had appeared to be random colonial expansion revealed itself as a meticulously planned network of defensive installations, each tailored to exploit the weaknesses of potential aggressors. "New Geneva Station orbiting Kepler Prime," Voss began, highlighting a settlement that most galactic observers had dismissed as a marginal agricultural colony. "Atmospheric processors specifically calibrated to deploy aerosol compounds targeting Velkari calcium absorption. Range, 3-star systems. Deployment time, 4 hours. Texi's medical support frame creaked as he sagged against its restraints. Riton Colony Centauri Secundus. Pressure regulation systems capable of generating atmospheric conditions lethal to Keth physiology across an entire planetary surface. Cascade deployment through neighboring systems. 18 hours maximum. Councillor Zeftar's labored breathing became even more pronounced as the implications registered. "Meridian Outpost appears to be a mining operation," she continued, enjoying the growing horror on her audience's faces. "In reality, it's a thermal manipulation facility, capable of creating temperature fluctuations that would render Zenari populations cognitively non-functional across a 12-system radius. The display shifted to show shipping manifests, trade routes, and supply chains that painted an even more disturbing picture. Human commercial ventures weren't just gathering intelligence. They were actively positioning assets for what could only be described as species-specific siege warfare. The truly elegant aspect, Voss noted, is how voluntary your cooperation has been. Every cultural exchange program, every joint research initiative, every trade agreement has allowed us to place our assets exactly where we need them. You invited us into your territory because you considered us harmless. This is madness, Commander Rixan whispered, his voice barely audible through the sedatives required to stop his involuntary molting. You're describing preparations for genocide. Genocide? Voss looked genuinely offended. Commander, I'm hurt. We're not planning to exterminate anyone. We're simply ensuring that aggression against humanity becomes prohibitively inconvenient. There's a significant difference. She manipulated the displays to show population centers, industrial facilities, and government installations throughout hegemony space. Each target was marked with precise tactical assessments that demonstrated an understanding of alien society that bordered on the supernatural. Velkar leadership operates through hierarchical consensus based on perceived physical dominance, she explained, as if discussing weather patterns. Calcium depletion renders your entire command structure psychologically incapable of maintaining authority. No violence required. Your own cultural programming does the work for us. Keith's decision-making depends on collective respiratory synchronization during council sessions. Atmospheric pressure manipulation prevents consensus formation at the neurological level. Your democracy becomes physically impossible. Zenari emotional regulation drives all social interaction. Temperature control disrupts their ability to communicate anything more complex than basic survival needs. Civilization reverts to subsistence-level functioning. Each revelation hit the assembled delegates like a carefully aimed psychological sledgehammer. What they were witnessing wasn't just military planning, it was cultural vivisection performed with surgical precision. The beauty of this approach, Voss continued, is its complete reversibility. Withdraw aggression against human interests, and the effects cease immediately. Resume hostile actions, and discover what happens when a species that survived several attempts at self-extermination decides you represent a long-term problem. She closed the displays and returned her attention to the medical teams working frantically to stabilize their patients. I believe this concludes today's educational presentation. The revised mining contracts await your signatures. I trust you'll find the terms more reasonable than our previous negotiations suggested. Texai struggled to lift his head, his golden eyes now holding something that might have been respect, or might have been terror. How long have you been planning this? Planning? Voss considered the question with the air of someone deciding what to have for lunch. We weren't planning anything, Delegate Prime. We were simply doing what humans do, paying attention to our environment and adapting to survive. The fact that your species mistook our adaptability for submission is unfortunate but not particularly surprising. She began packing her equipment with the same methodical precision she'd used 3 days earlier, though the context had shifted somewhat dramatically. You slapped me because you wanted to teach me a lesson about hierarchy and respect. Consider your lesson delivered. And our lesson? Voss paused in her packing, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Your lesson, Delegate Prime, is that the most dangerous predator is always the one you don't see coming. Humans spent millennia learning to hunt creatures stronger, faster, and better adapted than ourselves. We succeeded because we paid attention, planned ahead, and never forgot that survival trumps pride. She sealed her case and headed toward the chamber's exit, pausing at the threshold just as she had 3 days earlier. This time, however, the assembled delegates watched her with the wary attention of prey animals, who had suddenly realized they were sharing space with an apex predator. "Oh, and gentlemen," she added, her voice carrying the same pleasant tone she'd used throughout the presentation. "Next time you encounter a species you consider primitive, you might want to ask yourselves why they're still alive. The answer is usually more interesting than you'd expect." The door sealed behind her, leaving 6 different species to contemplate the uncomfortable realization that they'd just been comprehensively outmaneuvered by the galactic equivalent of the quiet kid who sat in the back of the class and took excellent notes. 3 hours later, the revised mining contracts were signed with unprecedented speed. The terms were so favorable to humanity that several junior delegates wondered if there had been some kind of clerical error. There hadn't been. The galaxy's superior civilizations had just learned what Earth's children discovered in primary school. Never pick on someone smarter than you, especially if they've been quietly studying your weaknesses while you weren't paying attention. Dr. Kira Voss returned to her quarters and poured herself a glass of wine. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sounds of diplomatic communications being frantically transmitted to homeworlds across the galaxy, each one carrying the same basic message. Humanity was considerably more dangerous than previously assessed. She raised her glass in a silent toast to the elegant simplicity of applied evolution. The galaxy had wanted to teach humans about respect and hierarchy. Mission accomplished, though perhaps not quite in the way they'd originally intended. Lessons were the ones that left a lasting impression.